I want to weigh in on the much discussed topic of instances in combat in Star Citizen. Let's look first at what many of us expect, or at least hope, the game will be able to do. Imagine your freelancers being chased by the bad guys and you're running for help. Moving from one CryEngine instance to an adjacent instance should happen seamlessly and transparently. As you approach the boundary with another instance, information from that instance should be incorporated into your perspective. Crossing the boundary shouldn't be like passing through a curtain, where what's in front of you suddenly appears and what's behind you disappears. We have also been told that escaping a fight will require a pilot to open the distance between themselves and any opponents to some yet-to-be-defined disengagement range, after which you can engage autopilot or another form of quick travel. Beautiful, right? But beauty may be only skin deep. So when might instancing make things ugly? Due to the nature of the game, we know combat will be sensitive to latency. To alleviate this, CIG plans on having server clusters to host combat instances located around the world. Taking our previous scenario, let's assume both you and your attackers are in North America. You'd be matched on a North American cluster. But what if your would-be rescuers were French? The instance spawn for them would be hosted in Europe. A seamless and transparent transition between the two would require real-time synchronization between servers across an ocean. Even if this were possible, is it fair? Not only are you getting the assistance of your friends, but your pursuers are moved from a low-latency environment to one of high latency. Perhaps as you approach your friends, who are not in combat, their instance is handed off from Europe to North America. Is that fair? Such a mechanism could be exploited by aggressors, allowing them to dictate where combat is hosted. Or perhaps you aren't the only one with friends, and your rescuers are already fighting, in Europe, before you arrive. Ugly. We find another example when too many people want to occupy the same space at the same time, such as around a busy space station. The game will spawn a new instance which, as far as the galaxy is concerned, maps to the same physical location as the instance that's full. As more and more people arrive around the station, instances begin to stack up. Arriving via autopilot may not be problematic from an immersion standpoint because you can just be plopped into your assigned instance as you come out of warp. But flying manually to or from an adjacent instance presents immersion and gameplay complications. As you approach the station from an adjacent instance, which of its many stacked instances will you see as you near the border? The game would have to predetermine which instance you'd enter if you crossed the border and reserve a spot for you in that instance to guarantee you could cross when the time comes. If too many pilots approach the border from the station's stacked instances, it could force the spawning of additional adjacent instances to accommodate all the necessary reserve spots. So while we preserve some immersion, we also introduce a potentially exploitable game mechanic. Even then, we aren't guaranteed continuity. Imagine the ship next to you is pre-allocated to a different instance. If it's shot by someone in that instance, what would you see? When it crosses the border, does it just disappear? What about people arriving into your instance from any of the other stacked instances? Do they just appear out of nowhere? There are ways to minimize the frequency with which these situations occur, but they have significant implications on both gameplay and server resources. But some scenarios present challenges which aren't simply immersion breaking, but potentially game breaking. In large fleet fights, there will almost always be some target of higher value than the rest, maybe an asteroid base, or simply the enemy's fleet commander. In this example, let's use Wingman's mighty bagel carrier. As too many people converge on the same place at the same time, the game will generate stacked instances. So how might combat in such an environment adhere to the principles I set out in the text of my post? It's been suggested that CIG endeavor to make persistent objects, such as Wingman's carrier, exist in every instance in the stack during combat. With an arbitrary number of instances, I don't believe it's technically possible. But even if it were, how would you balance the durability of a capital ship versus an arbitrary number of attackers? If blobbing ever larger benefits aside, in my experience, that's exactly what they'll do. That said, how would combat play out? As we saw earlier, flying through the boundary of a CryEngine instance moves you into the physically adjacent instance. Now imagine it's an Idris you have burning and venting Atmo that made it across the boundary. If you already have friends in that instance, there may not be room for you to pursue. The continuity of the fight would be broken. I suggest when the game determines a fight spans multiple stacked instances, they occur in what I'll call pseudospace. In pseudospace, flying through a boundary grows the pseudospace by appending a new CryEngine instance which does not map to the physically adjacent instance in the galaxy. It's simply an extension of the battlefield. The whole of a layer of pseudospace would be limited to the same number of ships as a single CryEngine instance. In this way, we preserve the continuity of each sub-battle within each stack layer of pseudospace. So if pseudospace grows as you move, how do you exit? More importantly, how do you transit from one stacked layer to another? Given we're looking for a way to simulate flanking an opponent in a different layer, I believe it should require an act of piloting, one that can be countered by opponents in your current layer. My idea leverages the previously discussed concept of a disengagement range. A ship's HUD can be toggled to project a regular polyhedron centered at the initial CryEngine instance that encompasses the entire pseudospace layer. In this manner, space can be divided into wedges defined by the faces of the polyhedron. Exiting the current layer requires you to achieve disengagement range from your enemies. Upon doing so, your possible destinations, entering autopilot, or an adjacent instance, or a different layer of pseudospace, are determined by the wedge you're in. So transiting to a specific destination layer, such as the one containing the enemy carrier, will require a pilot to maneuver to, and achieve disengagement range within, a specific wedge. Making all this work in a space sim is going to be a challenge, but I've got one more small request of Chris and the design team. Pew pew!